All right, good. Well, thank you and welcome to all of you to our first forum of the fall calendar season. My name is Teresa Woodruff and I serve as the director of the Women's Health Research Institute, and it's a real pleasure to see so many of you who have been here with us in these forums for the last several years. Welcome back to all of you. And for those of you who are here for the first time to learn about what the Women's Health Research Institute is doing at our institution and indeed across the globe, welcome to you as well. So I will be delivering the lecture today, so I'll be giving you a little bit of an overview on what we've been doing in the Institute, and I'm excited to launch the forum season, which in fact has been sponsored this year by Evergreen Invitational Women's Health Grant Initiatives, which is actually providing the funding for videotaping of each of our lectures. And so I know that many of you have gone to our website to get the meeting notes from past forums, and those have been very popular. And we'll now be posting the actual videos from each of the forums. And not only will they be available to all of you, but they'll be available throughout the Northwestern Medicine network as well as beyond. So we think that these are going to be tools that are part of our mission to enable physicians to understand and utilize sex-inclusive science and medicine, as well as to empower our patients with knowledge that will help them as they talk and discuss with their providers about the kinds of medicines and interventions that are going to be important to improve their health. So we really thank Evergreen for that funding. I think many of you know that our Women's Health Research Institute's mission is to facilitate and advocate the inclusion of sex and gender as variables in all of basic science as well as medicine. And we do that in a whole variety of ways. And I'll just note, because this is our first day together, that there are a variety of online resources in addition to the videos. There are newsletters, there are blogs, we tweet, which seems very exciting to all of us. There are monthly e-newsletters, and I just heard from a friend of mine in D.C. where the Office of Women's Health is holding its annual council meeting, and I'm here with you rather than with them. But I did get an email from one of our leaders there congratulating Northwestern on the kind of materials that we are disseminating throughout our network. So I think that's very important news for all of you. I also wanted to note for all of you that on October 30th, I know you have information on this, but we have, through the sponsorship of Friends Apprentice, we're hosting our second annual symposium on treating women differently, the case for sex-based medicine. This is going to be an afternoon of lectures and workshop for clinicians, researchers, and the public. This will be a CME-approved event, so if those of you who are clinicians would like that CME materials, please stop at the desk after this. Dr. Marla Mendelson, who's given a lecture on cardiovascular health in this series in the past, very effective leader in sex inclusion, science, and medicine, will be the chair of that particular symposium. And we're going to talk about cardiology, dermatology, gastroenterology, infectious diseases, neurology, pelvic hair, psychiatry, and rheumatology. And I think that list has expanded every single year we've had a Women's Health Institute, because we've been able to permeate all of the divisions and departments of the institution to make sure that sex matters as we're doing our everyday science and medicine. So please participate in these activities. These are very exciting for us. And then I'll just announce now that on November 3rd will be our next Women's Health Research Forum. It will not be in this room. It will be over in the Lurie Research Building in the Hughes Auditorium. And Judy Chang will be here and is going to talk about intimate partner violence. So put those things on your calendars for upcoming important events. So today I'm going to kick off our forum season by really thinking about sex inclusion in basic research. And I want to make a couple of arguments for you about this topic as being really something that I think is rather obvious. And I know many of you would agree with me that sex inclusion just seems to make sense. If you're talking about basic science and you describe temperature and time as part of one of the biological variables, doesn't it make sense that we would be studying and including sex as one of those variables? But really the upsetting truth is that we don't do that. And I'll provide some of the evidence that Northwestern scientists have put together that is really compelling many of our policymakers in DC that we've really got to do something about this. So sex inclusion is really a disruptive technology, and it's something that we're starting here. Adaptive behavior is that as we develop policies, then our scientists and clinicians have to now adapt to new guidelines. I'm going to describe some of those guidelines that now exist, some of which will begin in January of 2016. Things we can be very proud of that hopefully folks will be required to do at the beginning, but then once they really understand the power of sex-inclusive science, will eventually be able to make the kind of discoveries that I think is going to usher in an entirely new era of health for people in this country. And that's why I think this is a sound investment. There are those who think that when we think about sex inclusion, science, and medicine, that we're really duplicating the kinds of costs that we've already done if we do single-sex science. And I think that's not the right argument. I think as long as there is harm coming to one or both sexes because of these policies, there's no way we can make that economic argument sound. And in fact, by investing in this area of science and medicine, we're going to have a new generation of individuals for whom their health has been precisely assessed, and therefore their medicine is more better enabled for their long-term health. And so that's where we get to better medicine. So I'm a basic scientist. I think many of you who have been in these forums know I study fundamental science, and so I always start with a hypothesis, which is basically a way we can frame an idea in order to address it in a scientific way, and in the end, be able to prove or refute that hypothesis. So this gives us a very quantitative way of determining whether or not we're really doing something important or not. So let me run this hypothesis by you, and at the end, we'll kind of come back to it and see if we buy that we have been able to make the arguments that would either accept or refute the hypothesis. And that is that I think the next generation of biomedical advances that improve the lives of all people, males and females, will require fundamental discovery research that includes sex as a variable. Now, maybe that's not such a surprising hypothesis given the way I started this particular lecture, but that's the argument that I want to build, that in fact we can test whether or not we can improve the lives of all people by having sex included at the very earliest stages of science and medicine. Now, I do want to have a black box warning on my lecture before getting too far, and that is that the data I'm going to be presenting can be rather upsetting. And that is because modern science and medicine is doing the null hypothesis right now. They are running the hypothesis that it doesn't matter to include sex as one of the variables. There is no reporting of sex in many clinical trials. There is no personalization of medicine for males and females. There's practically no inclusion of sex as a variable in the basic sciences for either cells or animals. And so this is, for many of us who have conditions that maybe we've had treatments or medicines, this can be rather upsetting. And I just want to tell you that the news is good, that in the future we will have, I think, more policies in place that is going to improve this. But as I'll describe today, Northwestern is on the forefront of this kind of science and medicine, where in fact we are including sex as a variable from the bench to the bedside. And I'll be describing some of those important outcomes in our discussion today. So let me start with the worst news possible, and then we'll get to the better news. This is a report from the Institute of Medicine from the United States, Institute of Medicine, the very best minds on science and medicine, and it was titled Shorter Lives, Poorer Health. And it looked at the health of individuals in the wealthiest 25 countries on the planet and asked, were there any sex differences in a variety of health outcomes? And in fact, what they found was that the shorter lives represented both males and females. So in the United States, our lives are subtly, very slightly less shorter than other countries. The important thing is poor health. We have subtly lower poor health, but the more important and more difficult issue is the shorter lives. And that's really females, that females fall off the curve relative to all other countries that are wealthy, just like the United States. And in fact, if you look at this county-by-county demographic of males in the top versus females, where health is getting poorer and lives are getting shorter, and that is denoted by the red, you can see that there are counties all across the United States where women's lives are being shortened by the kinds of science and medicine that is being provided them to today. So this really is, I think, a clarion call to action for all of us, and one of the real reasons the Women's Health Research Institute has this as its prime objective. And this is actually the probability of survival to age 50 in 21 of the high-income countries from this report, so just to the age of 50. And if you look here, these are the males, and here are all the different countries, and you can see that the male demographic in the US is lower than many of the other countries, but it's still within the ballpark of normal. But look at the red for females in the United States. And I think this is one of the most startling statistics that the United States government has ever put out, and that is that our probability to survive to the age of 50 as females in the United States is not only different from males, but it differs significantly from any other country in the United States. This is an issue that we now need to address. We can no longer say that the way we do science and medicine today can be the way we continue to do it. And so that's the thesis for my talk today. So when we started the Women's Health Research Institute, which, as you know, we rebranded last year with the new motto, Science to Care, and I think that really embodies a very pithy way that we think about including women in all aspects of science as well as in medicine. We really believe that we're standing at a time in science and medicine where there can be enormous gains, that we know that there are issues, we know that there are problems, but we have a series of solutions that we can now adequately address, we believe, many of these particular issues. And knowledge of sex, if we had no knowledge of what was driving some of these disparities that are frankly so upsetting, I think we would just throw our hands up. But we know that there is no inclusion of sex as one of the biological variables. Therefore, we think that we have a real opportunity to include this and really change the curves over time. So the Women's Health Research Institute has been actively involved in trying to change many of these equations by basically being a clearinghouse where all of us can come together on a monthly basis. We are increasing the number of women in clinical trials through a statewide registry that I'll be describing some of the demographics in just a moment. We've created awareness on the importance of sex and gender for health professionals. We had no specialty clinics outside of OBGYN at Northwestern before the WHRI started its work. This is a quantifiable change in the way we do medicine at Northwestern, which is something we should all be very proud of. We have authored high-impact journal articles and policy letters. The Leadership Council of the Women's Health Research Institute is not shy about getting data-driven information into the hands of our Congress members, both at the state level and at the federal level, and making sure that that's just not the way we think, but it's backed up by high-impact journal articles that have then resulted in a changing NIH policy. And we have letters from the NIH that basically started by saying, nope, that's not something we're going to be interested in, to letters that now say, yes, we're now persuaded. This is something we really should be involved in. So I think we should all be proud collectively at Northwestern that we are on the leading edge of this kind of conversation. We've created mentorship opportunities to make sure that we have a pipeline of thinkers in this area, and primarily women, to make sure that we continue to have the kind of individuals who can make a difference in science and medicine in the future. And we've developed a series of interactive tools that allow us to help make informed decisioning. And many of you have used some of these tools on the WHRI website. One of these includes a menopause tool, and you'd think that something like this would be available, but in fact it's not. And so that tool has been widely used by people not only here in Illinois, and thanks to Google Analytics, we know it's useful all around the globe. We're an authoritative source about women's health research to a variety of news outlets, including things like the 60 Minutes, all the way to the Colbert Report. As you remember last year, we talked about Leslie Stahl and her visit to Northwestern to really find out what's going on. She was shocked that this was something that was not a solved issue, that this was something that even for her health was something that she couldn't count on, the kinds of medicine that she was being given. And so this kind of attention to the issue was really important, and 60 Minutes is a good kind of media outlet. But of course, the information soared when Stephen Colbert had something to say on the topic. And so that's really an important way that Northwestern is in the media. We're always ready to bring attention to this issue. We've had a series of pilot projects, and this started when we began the Women's Health Institute in 2007. We really had to do what I call a little bit of hand-to-hand persuasion, or sometimes hand-to-hand combat, to make sure that people understood that this was important. And so at the very outset, we had a small pool of pilot grants, and we were able to go and talk to very key thought leaders and say, what if you did this kind of study, not just using males, but also using females? Melina Kibbe was one of the people that did this, and many of you know the story of her work on peripheral vascular disease, where she now has completely opposite effects of a drug in males and females. And the only reason she did that was that we asked her to do so using pilot funds that now is an entire area of scholarship and research for this extraordinarily accomplished scientist for whom in the past, male animals were the only biological subject for her entire study case. So these pilot grants have been really instrumental in building the case at a basic science level. And as my friend Catherine Woolley, who got one of the first pilot grants, told me, she said, I was not convinced by this at all, but I will take your money. And so she's now just reported in the last 2 weeks, and you may have seen this even in the media, that there are steroid hormones in the brain that differ in the way they regulate cognitive function in the hippocampus. And she's at the neuroscience meeting today giving a plenary lecture on this new science about male and female learning and memory because of a pilot grant and because we persuaded her to do this kind of study. Otherwise, she was only studying females. And so if we really think about the value of studying male and female, I think the level of biomedical discovery is going to increase remarkably. And I primarily believe that science in medicine, that having science embedded in medicine is the key difference maker. And that's why I'm in a clinical department as a basic scientist, because I fundamentally believe that what we do matters to the next generation of patients. And I know many of my basic scientists believe me. And so by insisting that they think about sex as a variable has been an important part of what we've been doing. And so I think now we have to catalyze some of these gains, which are really a little bit in our rearview mirror. Where are we going next? Into this comprehensive health for women and men. We're the voice for innovation. We've talked about this quite a bit, and we're trying to really redesign the definition of women's health. We're not the other. We're not the default. We are part of the health equation. So let me just very quickly relate to you some of the terminology here so that we're all on the same page. So for all of us, we are the product of our genes. And so when we talk about sex, the two fundamental differences are whether or not we have two X chromosomes or if we have an X and a Y chromosome. And so when we study the genetics of any disease, if you have an X or a Y, that really completely changes the background of all of the cells in your body. So chromosomal sex is an important part of just fundamental cellular biology. Now, these genes are important, as I think all of us are aware, to then the organization of each of us as male or female. And one of the ways they principally do this during early development is by turning on a series of hormones. The master hormones are estrogen and testosterone. And these two hormones then masculinize or feminize the various organ systems within the body system of the offspring. We also have environmental impact on health and disease, and I'll bring to you one of the recent studies looking at the sex of the microbiome. I think many of us are amazed at how influential the bacteria of our gut are on our overall health. And it turns out that the sex of those microbiome really influences health and disease. And we know that there are real influences of nutrition on male and female. And so this environmental effect and endocrine disrupting compounds that are in the environment, because they interact with the hormones that are regulating overall body chemistry and body function, they represent a key part of the sex inclusion equation that we have to really be thoughtful about. And then finally, of course, anatomy. The anatomy of males and females as instructed by the genes, sometimes through hormones and sometimes through other signaling pathways, can really vary very dramatically. And I think many of you have heard lectures in this forum in the past about the difference in the anatomy of the vasculature that feeds into the heart. And for many women years ago, and about 20 years ago, we would have very different outcomes in terms of heart attack because women would have occlusions in small vessels, men in large vessels. And women would come in complaining of of pressure on their chest, and they'd say, well, you're not having a heart attack, and the women would go home and die. And so we've luckily been able to change that equation pretty dramatically over the last 20 years. But as I'll tell you in just a moment, the unsettling truth is that our journals and our basic science still does not study male and female biology independently. And so these are, while we do have some true advances and some lessons learned, there is more that we need to do. So each of these areas is something that we think about as we think about sex in the environment. Now, I also want to bring up the word gender. So sex and gender are sometimes used interchangeably. And one of the reasons to use that interchangeably is because sometimes we're afraid to use the word sex. So we're using the word sex or sex inclusive. Sometimes people think you're talking about having sex. And I'm not talking about having sex. We're talking about the biological sex of a male and a female. And so sometimes just the use of the word sex can be a barrier to thinking about this topic. So in fact, trying to make this a little bit more gentle is to use the word gender. And in fact, when the first policy on sex inclusion from NIH came out, and the director of our Office of Women's Health talked on one of the news reports, I can't remember which, she used gender the whole time. And this was to try and soften, and she said this was to try and soften the topic so people didn't think we were talking about having sex. Well, for this audience in this room, we're talking about sex. We're not talking about having sex. We're talking about the biology of sex. And that is the physical and biological characteristics that identify us as male or female. Gender itself can also be studied and should be studied as an independent variable. And it is largely a social construct that associates behaviors, roles, and expectations the way we assign maleness or femaleness. And this can also be important to health and disease. How a male physician versus a female physician interacts with a male patient or a female patient is one way that gender can be a part of overall health management. In the basic sciences, it's also been shown that whether or not a male technician versus a female technician interacts with the mice in a cage can influence that animal's behavior. So those ways of understanding gender as a part of basic science as well as medicine is an important part of the equation. Now, largely, we've been focused on the sex part of the equation, but I want to note that gender is a really important aspect of the biology that we don't want to forget as we're thinking through all of the different aspects of improving the overall biomedical pipeline leading to better health. So why do we need sex-based research? And so part of it is that really historically, there was this notion that beyond the reproductive axis, none of this really mattered. There wasn't really that big of a difference, and it wasn't that big of a deal. Therefore, we could study all of the drugs on males, and it really would just be one size fits all. And in fact, women were excluded specifically from many studies. And so that meant that we were trying to apply what we learned from men to women. And what this resulted in are 8 out of the last 10 drugs withdrawn from FDA in a GAO study were due to adverse events in women, because we were having a policy that said that men and women are equal, that what I learn in a male is going to be equivalent in the female. And that really means that we're really not helping either males or females in the overall biology and the new medicines that are coming down the pipeline. Drug safety issues in pregnancy, lactation, menopause, and many other life events have not been adequately assessed. This is something that we think needs to also be addressed. And really, we're not looking at any of the basic fundamental differences at the cellular or molecular level. And this was, again, because for many folks, they thought, well, that has to do with those folks who study reproductive health. Not with me, because I study irritable bowel disease. That has nothing to do with me. But in fact, the argument that I'll be making is that it really does matter to every single discipline of science and medicine. And in so doing, we're going to learn things that will transform science and medicine. So this is a slide that Sharon Green built when she was the director here at the Women's Health Institute, showing that really women's health is the constellation of all these different balls, that each one of these are areas where there are opportunities for inclusion of women in clinical studies and in basic science. And it's not just in reproductive science, but I also want to say that reproductive science is important. That we also include reproductive science in the equation is important, not to exclude any one area. So let me give you some of the hallmarks of the timeline for where we've been and where we're going. So in 1977, the FDA actually barred women of childbearing age from participating in early stage research. And this was due to real harm that had happened to women, primarily due to thalidomide and DES and fetal anomalies and offspring anomalies that occurred from some of those drugs. And so the notion was that women were a vulnerable population. So women and children were recategorized. And FDA said because of that vulnerability, we're not going to have them included in studies. And so this meant that there largely were no women, not just of reproductive years, but of all decades, because of this fear of adverse events to the offspring. In 1985, the Public Health Service then reported that the exclusion of women was a problem, that this was actually detrimental to women's health. And this was at the time when many cardiovascular drugs, aspirin, TPA, tissue plasminogen activator, which is the clot buster, many of these drugs were being studied on 50 and 100,000 men, but not on women. And so I was actually at Genentech in South San Francisco when the TPA, the tissue plasminogen activator, which is one of the great biotech success stories of all time, was actually approved. That drug was approved, but its approval was done on only males through the GISSI and the Gusto trials. And so these represented some of the real reasons that the Public Health Service began to say that one size may not fit all, and it's actually detrimental or harmful to women. So in 1986, NIH then adopted guidelines urging the inclusion of women in NIH-sponsored trials, and the GAO in 1990 said, well, look, it's not really happening. We've been able to go and do an independent assessment, and women are still not being included. There's not been a persuasive argument made. You've said that we should do it, but have not made any teeth behind it. In 92, the GAO then issued another report that women were included in a few studies, but there was nothing analyzed by sex. And so in 1993 was the first time that then Congress mandated that NIH enact a law by which women would be included in NIH studies. They've never done the same thing for FDA. So FDA does not have that same requirement, although there's a good deal of pressure right now on the FDA. But the NIH was told you have to include women if you're going to do an NIH-authored study or say why you're not going to use women. And so there's actually a form page that you fill out in order to do this. So if we look at this and now we feed forward all the way to 2015, we could say, well, everything's solved. We've been able to do it through a policy interdiction, and now we're all okay. Well, are we getting better? Well, in fact, the answer, unsettlingly, is no. Unsettling is the word of the day. Is everybody with me on the unsettling word? Are you unsettled? Everybody's unsettled? Well, we're going to have some answers, I hope, but it is unsettling. So Stacy Geller, who's here at the University of Illinois, Chicago, one of my great friends who's given one of these forum lectures in the past, actually looked at NIH-funded randomized clinical studies and looked between 2004 and 2009 when the data were available, and there was actually a slight erosion in the percent of females that were included in sex-specific trials, and 64% didn't report the outcome by sex. So sex-specific analysis and reporting, unfortunately, remains very low. Well, that was Stacy's work in 2011, so then several of my colleagues, including Melina Kibbe, my great friend, decided to look at the surgical literature and to see what was happening in the surgical literature. And she published this just last year, Sex Bias Exists in Basic Science and Translational Surgical Research, a terrific paper and editorial that she published. And so this is in the surgical world. And again, we're looking, has there been a change over time, or are we at least getting a little bit better because of these policies? And in fact, what you can see, if anything, the percent of manuscripts are actually getting poorer in their reportable outcome of sex. And so then she and her students looked to see, well, what about those diseases that are more prevalent in women? If we just look at those diseases, what happens to the sex inclusion? Surely we're including females in cardiovascular disease or thyroid disease, which is disproportionately female. What about obesity, depression? And so when she did this study, 44% of those did not specify the sex studied. And of those that did specify the sex, 88% included only males. So we have still a very difficult time relating the NIH policy to the outcomes that we can measure in the scientific journals. And so what about one of the diseases that Melina mentioned, cardiovascular disease? Marla Mendelson has been at our forum in the past, and this is one of her slides, which talks about heart disease. It is the leading cause of death in American women, and it far outstrips stroke, lung cancer, or breast cancer with the number of individuals who are affected by cardiovascular disease. So what do we know about women in cardiovascular disease? So this is also a slide from Marla, and the source for this was the Society for Women's Health Research. Well, women manifest heart disease 10 years later than women, and cardiovascular deaths have decreased in men and more slowly in women. And she showed one of these plots where for men, cardiovascular deaths have really dropped really significantly, a great story. And the fact that it is improving the lives of men, the science that we're doing now, that is terrific. And we would all agree that that's what we want. We just want to now bend the curve for the females in the same direction as the males. More women than men suffer stroke, and female strokes have a different kind of fibrillation that occurs as a consequence. Women who present with congestive heart failure have a variety of comorbid diseases like diabetes. Cardiac arrest is higher in men, but women have lower recovery and survival rate. Part of that is the way the differences in the anatomy that we talked about. Part of it is a gender difference. When a man comes into the emergency room, and again, I think I'm really, I'm channeling my inner Marla. She says a man will come in with a cardiovascular event and say, I want to be seen now, and goes to the nearest clinician and said, I must be seen. And a woman says, well, I'm feeling a little tired. It's all right, take someone else. I might just be, it might be a little indigestion. You young resident, you take care of someone else. I'm really not the person you need to be dealing with. That's a gender difference in the way we present our health and disease. We don't want to put ourselves as females in front of someone else who might actually be more ill. And as a consequence, we put ourselves in a position to have poorer care and poorer outcomes. So we have to think about all of the complexity as we think through these topics. There is not just one way we have to attack each one of these different issues. Women have less diagnostic tests for heart disease, despite the recommendations, very clear recommendations, cardiovascular recommendations for female, and we have less priority put on interventions. So the IOM hosted a workshop on cardiovascular science itself, the Institute of Medicine, and they showed that women were less than 40% of study participants, and 19 cardiovascular randomized control studies had 27% females. And if we look at the journal reporting, what are we seeing there? Again, this is cardiovascular disease. We're now going to the basic science journals. As we look at all these journals, unspecified versus male and female. So the majority of all these studies do not specify the sex. And I think that's really one of the major outcomes of what we need to change within our field, is to make sure that sex as a variable is at least described. If you use all males, say you use all males. And I happened to be the Endocrine Society president 2 years ago, and we insisted that the Endocrine Society journals all adopt this procedure. So we don't tell a scientist that you can't publish, but we do say you have to say what the sex is. And if it was a single-sex study, that has to be in the title. So with that, we know that we were studying female thyroid disease, and that the results are not necessarily transferable between males and females. That's at least a first step that our journals that are within our societies that we may have a little bit more leeway with versus some of the journals like Nature and Science, who are independent publishing authorities and profitable organizations. There may be different ways we have to talk with that group. So what are we doing differently at Northwestern Medicine? I hope many of you do come back for the September 30th event, where we really go through each of the internal medicine departments and identify all the strengths we have in women's health. And here at Northwestern, we do have a heart disease and pregnancy program. We have a specific group that are working on microvascular disease in women's for those small vessels that are occluded in females and are hard to see on angiograms. We have a very specific program in that area. There are annual updates and symposium for both professionals and the community. I've given a lecture in that sequence. I think many of you in the room have been to those. These are really important ways we disseminate the knowledge out to other clinicians within our environment to make sure they know what resources are available, as well as what to look for in this particular health concern. And then we have sex-specific research that has been inspired by some of the pilot programs, as well as within the Department of Cardiovascular of Cardiology, including ways to treat females differently, valve surgery outcomes, arrhythmias, and preconception evaluation for women with heart disease. This is one of Marla's areas to make sure that the gender side of the equation doesn't limit women's access to good cardio care. I've just got two more examples, I think, of areas where there are disparities, because I know many of you do come to our forums, and so each week you've been able to hear a little bit about some of these topics. I'll just remind you of the sex differences in obesity. We have really health concern. Obesity and diabetes are tsunamis that are really overwhelming our healthcare environment. And one of the concerns that I have are some of the emerging trends in sex differences in this area. So obesity, the frank obesity, where BMI is greater than 30 kgs per meter squared, women are more obese than men, but just slightly. But the more difficult management of obesity is called metabolic syndrome, where there's abdominal obesity. And this is where you have a lot of the comorbidities, a lot of the complexities associated with managing metabolic syndrome. And here, females are disproportionately higher rate of metabolic syndrome versus females. And when you go to Congress, you have to start telling them that this costs you money, and that if we could bend the cost curve a little bit, we would improve health and the government's bottom line. And so, in fact, there is about $4,000 per capita, every American per capita annual spending because of the issue of obesity. And now just one final thing that I think is really important for us to appreciate as we look at the obesity epidemic and metabolic syndrome in children. Look at now where we are with boys versus girls. So if we look at the adolescent demographic, boys have metabolic syndrome. Remember, this is the worst outcome on the obesity scale. They have far more prevalence than do girls. And there are also differences in white versus black individuals versus Mexican Americans. And if we just did the aggregate right here, which is the way we used to do science and medicine, we would really be missing the places that we need to go faster. And that is in boys and Mexican Americans, in order to make sure that those individuals don't convert into very unhealthy adolescents and then ultimately young men. So obesity and metabolic syndrome are intimately intertwined with diabetes. And we've had talks from this podium in the forum in the past on type 1 diabetes. And this is a really good study from the basic sciences that looked at diabetes incident and onset by sex. And you'll be probably not surprised to know that this was one of the first studies of its kind. And Jane Danska was here from the Hospital for Sick Children to share this with us. And this is the cumulative rate of type 1 diabetes in male and female animals. And she not only looked at male and female, but then within females, she looked at the reproductive history, a really wise way of looking at the underpinnings of health within the females, and showed that the onset of diabetes in virgins versus mated, so in the breeders, which is here in the red, versus those that had not been bred, really differs. So there is a difference in the female outcome, the time to getting disease, based on whether or not they had been pregnant or not before. This is a really key intersection between reproductive health and overall health that we need to be mindful of. But the question that Jane was interested in, she's an immunologist and was interested in intestinal gut microbiome. She did a study, and I'm not going through all of the work that she's described that led her to the study, where she put in the male microbiomes into the females who were destined to acquire type 1 diabetes. And what you'll see is if you took the female microbiome and transplanted it back into the females, they actually acquired the disease at about the same rate as the control group. But if you took the male microbiome and put it into the females, the animals now did not go into type 1 diabetes. They had the male-like phenotype. This is a startling new result that really suggests that for some diseases, particularly in metabolic and obesity, that it is the sex of our microbiome that may drive some of the really profound differences between males and females. And so this is a new area of scholarship and research that may be one of those that in 5 years' time will point back and say, this was really where we started to change the curve on obesity, metabolic syndrome, and diabetes, because we now start thinking about sex as a way to uncover new biology that we couldn't otherwise, treat in a way we couldn't have thought of before, and maintain health perhaps in a way that was unimagined just a few years ago. So the final, how many did I say? Did I say I had just one more? I think this is that just one more, I'm not so sure. But sex and skin cancer epidemic. I think many of you know Amy Powler, our fantastic chair of dermatology, and she's been so passionate about sex inclusion, and she was one of the original members of the Women's Health Research Institute Leadership Council. And I will always remember this day. Amy tells the story even better than I do, but she had sat at several of our council meetings really thinking through sex inclusion and how we could really make a difference in each of the departments around the campus. And she all of a sudden just popped straight up. And if any of you know Amy, she's about this tall, so she's popped straight up and said, oh my gosh, in skin disease, there is no one that is studying anything to do with females, because 100% of us in the research field use the foreskin of males. And so there is no adult tissue, and there's no female tissue that has ever been studied in this area of dermatology. And it was one of those moments where the light bulb just was shining so brightly, and she started spooling out all the ways we were going to change. The Skin Disease Research Center at Northwestern, a very powerful center for the Midwest and skin disease, now routinely collects male and female skin samples for the last 4 years and distributes it very broadly. And when they went in for their last grant renewal, they made as a top-level topic the fact that we were studying at Northwestern sex as a biological variable in skin disease. And when their reviewers came back, they said this was the most amazing new innovation in skin disease research. And that's because they thought of including sex as a variable. And so this is important because, of course, there are diseases that are very lethal, like melanoma. There may be differences in the males and the females, and we think of that because of the incidence and because of the prognosis. And if we look actually at the sex and skin cancer epidemic, we see some of the same kinds of things that we saw in the IOM report. And that is, if we look at the annual incidence, then there is an increase in females versus male. Now, there are behavioral as well as basic science issues here. So in melanoma, the behavioral sex differences are that girls and young women, a gender difference, will be tanning more than males. And so now, because of the leadership of Amy and others, there are bans on tanning for girls younger than 18. But there are also sex differences in the biology of the skin thickness, the way the wounds heal in males and females, which can differ by age. And these are all things that now, using the keratinocytes and fibroblasts for male and female skin derivatives, they're going to be able to make many of these new discoveries. And Amy and her group and resident Betty Kong actually did look at some of these in some of their literature, and not surprisingly, sex wasn't specified in many of those cases. So they're now looking through the SDRC to develop these sex-based differences. They're trying to have an impact on female-dominated skin disorders, and Beth Schlosser is the director of our Women's Health Skin Cancer Program. They're looking at ways to look at inflammatory skin disease on maternal health and pregnancy outcomes, and all of these things I think are really critical. So I've given you a few examples of where there have been issues and where Northwestern Medicine and through the hopeful leadership of everyone in this room and the Women's Health Research Institute are leading the way in ensuring that sex is part of the conversation. But as we think about this very broadly, what our messaging, if we look back over the last 20 years and we can say, well, there were policies, but they really weren't followed. We've had this as an issue, but if we look at the literature and the FDA outcomes, we're still not having the kind of inclusion we'd like to have. So we have to go back and say, well, we're maybe not messaging this in precisely the right way. And so let's think about how we can message this a little bit. It's maybe a little hard to disseminate to the public as efficiently as we would want because we're using that term sex. And that term sex is so exploited in the public's eyes that sometimes they just don't want to hear about it. It's really tough sometimes to generate political capital. Who really cares about the way we include sex as a biological variable in cells and skin cells? These are things that we have to make really matter and personalize to individuals who are in a position to actually make a decision and make a legislative change. And then we have to really boil it down to one sentence. And it was this one sentence issue that I think was a stumbling block to the field until Stephen Colbert came up with it. And so Stephen says, gotta leave the females out. Any scientist knows it's crucial to eliminate extraneous variables like half the global population. And that single sentence from Colbert is one that we use when we go to Congress. And it really is resonating now. I think just that little satirical twist on the facts that we all know has changed the equation rather dramatically. So now we have not just, as you might expect, the female side of the Congress interested in this, but we have males and females really thinking that this is important. So we have to get more attention from government agencies, and we continue to do that. I mentioned that we have letters that go out constantly. A letter from your Leadership Council went out last week to House Ways and Means. We have to really advocate with consumers. Every one of us is a health consumer, so every one of us, when we sit with our doctor, need to ask, has this medicine been tested on males and females? And if we begin to do that, we begin to at least raise the awareness of all the physicians that we come in contact with that this matters to us. And if we don't ask, we're not going to get anywhere. So we really have to impose on ourselves a different behavioral way of interacting with the healthcare community. One of the barriers has been congressional earmarks and some of the diseases du jour and some of the gridlock that we've seen in Congress. And for some of my friends, this has meant that they just don't want to take this issue up. This just seems like it's too boutique. I think it's too important to not do. We have to do this in order to change the mortality and the shorter lives, poorer health of women in the United States. It's an imperative to me as much as the interstate highway road bill is that will come to a decision, we hope, by the end of this month. This is that same level of urgency, and we have to make our Congress folks understand that red line for women is falling further and further behind every other country, every other developed country on the planet. There have to be interested researchers who are trained in this field, and so one of the things we're developing is a researcher's toolbox to enable our scientists who maybe weren't exposed to this kind of science or hadn't really been thinking about this because they read the literature where sex is not described, or if sex is described, it's male. And so we need to actually build a toolbox for all of us to better enable this area. We have to understand some of the underlying pathophysiology. Sometimes it is sex-based, sometimes it's environmental-based, sometimes there's a gender aspect to the problem. So we have to be very thoughtful about all these variables, and that might seem like too much to think about, but it really isn't. Science is about teasing out all the different parts of a problem and coming to the next generation of solution. We may not be to the ultimate answer, but we take one step forward towards that solution. We have to have better diagnostics and screening tests, and we have to think about mortality as well as morbidity. And all of those things really are barriers, but those that we anticipate overcoming in the next several years. The issues of sex inclusion in animal research is even a little bit more a longer list, but we know all of these issues. And so we can begin to interact at specific nodes within each of these different areas in order to allow us to overcome some of the barriers so that the pipeline is full of important new outcomes that can be used in next generation medicine. And when my colleagues on the basic science side say, well, I'm not going to want to do this, or it's too expensive, I have another one sentence from Stephen Colbert. The long-standing tradition of testing on only males is based on the underlying assumption that females are simply a variation on a theme. Folks, that's science. Male is default human. And you know, if you make it a little satirical, perhaps some of our basic scientists will also understand. So our messaging really is that the biology of sex informs health and therefore matters to all stages of the biomedical research community, that the inclusion of sex in basic research is a cost-effective way to increase quality and to reduce long-term costs to the healthcare community. And from a personal side, there must be something more than having my baby and waiting for cancer, which is the way we think sometimes about women, from the pink breast cancer to pregnancy. There's much more to health and disease about that. And I think I'm really proud that we've been part of the organized effort to bring policy reform to the NIH, which as of January, I heard this morning, will actually be enacted policy so that every scientist will have to include males and females in their upcoming NIH reports. And I look forward to calls where people say, I don't want to do this, because we're going to be ready to help them, but it also means we've started to get things done. So I've talked a little bit about the ways we're going to be training researchers. We're going to be able to report on this. We want to monitor policy compliance better through our journals, both those that are society-based and those that are broader. We want to encourage professional societies to develop and disperse sex-based clinical guidelines to educate our clinicians, just as we do here at Northwestern. And many of the videos and the materials that we have online can be very useful to that. And we want to close some of the private industry clinical trial loopholes through the FDA, which there are very powerful lobbying agencies that are against any kind of change because they think it's going to cost more. I think it's going to make medicine better, and those companies for whom drugs have been withdrawn from the market because of adverse events in females are going to have a longer-term benefit to the drugs that do get to market. And I think making that economic argument is really, really critical. So just finally, you're a part of 66 monthly forums that have been started and run every month through the WHRI. We really appreciate all your participation. Many of you are in the Illinois Women's Health Registry, and I wanted to bring to you that there are about 7,000 strong members. We just all moved over to a new registry platform last year, and we had 7,400, and 6,800 of us all stayed together and moved to the new platform, so congratulations to all of you. We've matched 16,000 individuals and notified them that they were of interest to a clinical study, and 10,000 unique encounters agreed to participate in clinical studies. That transforms things in a really powerful way. Instead of pulling a piece of paper that has a phone number from the back of a bathroom stall, we now have a much more sophisticated way of including females in clinical studies, but also just increasing the pace and quality of clinical research in general. So thank you to everyone in the registry who has really made this possible for Northwestern broadly. I've talked about our letters to Congress. Of course, I've testified before Congress. We have publications that back this all up. We have press conference. We have a series of leadership councils and subcommittees meetings that are listed here. And if anyone's interested in getting agenda items in front of our council, please let me know or let Megan Castle know, because we're very anxious to continue the legacy of activities that each one of these super active committees constantly works on. We'll be continuing to track sex-inclusive scientific and clinical work at Northwestern. The Toolbox, we're going to expand our mission to clinical services and educational models all across the Chicago regional area where Northwestern Medicine is moving. We're going to create more visibility for issues around sex-inclusive science at the state and national level. We have a voice, and it's very powerful, and we need to continue to use it. And we are, through the We Will campaign, hoping to create endowed chairs in every department. So we're really embedding within the department individuals for whom sex-inclusive science is what they do. Imagine if we could hire Jane Danska at Northwestern, how powerful it would be if we really unraveled the power of the sex microbiome on health and disease. These are the kind of people, the superluminaries, that we want to attract to Northwestern. And then we're going to continue to expand the registry. It's a unique model. I will say we have about 7,000 members of our Women's Health Registry. We launched Men's Health Registry last May. We have 15 participants there, so we want more men. So women, I need you to get the men, all the men in the room, please get in the registry. I'm calling this Illinois All In. And so we really want to make sure that we have all of us in the registry. And these are some of the studies that you in the room have been participating in the registry. And again, I can't overemphasize the fact that we can go further faster if we have people who are ready to and understand clinical studies, and it's a very diverse population of individuals. This is really changing things really radically. So I started with a hypothesis, and that is that the next generation of biomedical advances will improve the lives of all people, will require fundamental discovery research that includes sex as a variable. And I fundamentally believe that that's the case, and we're on our way to trying to test this hypothesis and ultimately hope to inform the biology and the health of all of us in the future. So I mentioned that we're part of the We Will campaign for Northwestern. We have materials out in the hallway. All of you have been members of the forum for many of the 66 forums we've had. We need to deputize every one of you to help us get the kind of funding that's going to be necessary to continue this effort in a way that I think is going to be continue to be visible and viable and valuable for every male and female, not only in Illinois, but on the planet. So with that, I really want to thank all of you for your participation in this forum. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of a baseline for where we're headed, and we really would appreciate any feedback or information that you have for us. And then out on the hallway, we have all kinds of information that you can pick up that will enable you to be real partners in the Women's Health Research Institute. Thank you all very, very much.